for his body on the cross, his blood poured out for us, the weight of every curse upon him. Final breath he gave as heaven looked away. The Son of God was in darkness. The battle in the grave, the war on death was waged. The power of hell forever broken. The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever he is glorified. Forever he is lifted high. Forever he is risen. He is alive. Oh, he is alive. The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever he is glorified. Forever he is lifted high. Forever he is risen. Yes, he is alive. He's alive. He is alive. And we sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Oh, we sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing
Well, good morning, everyone, and blessed Resurrection Day. Wonderful day to be with you. I'm Alan Wright, pastor at Reynolda, and a very special word to anybody that's joining us by video at any of our campuses. If you've not been with us before, a very, very special word of welcome to you on this Easter day. Are you ready for some good news? Jesus is alive. And that changes everything. I want to start with a text in Matthew chapter 26 before the crucifixion. It's in Matthew 26, verse 31, after the Passover celebration, what we now know as the Lord's Supper. They go to Mount Olives, and verse 31, Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." To Galilee. And then the resurrection text of Matthew 28, verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he is risen as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I've told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. Go to Galilee. And there they will see me." I think it was back in the 1980s. Disney came up with a brilliant advertising campaign. The first one was with Phil Simms, a quarterback of the Super Bowl winning New York Giants. After he just won the Super Bowl, and they came up on camera and said, "Phil Simms, you've just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do now?" And he said, "I'm going to Disney World." And so launched this big advertising campaign that went on for years. And they reprised it in 2006. They had so many different Super Bowl winners that would win the Super Bowl. And they'd say, "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to Disney World." They had Olympic gold medalists, World Series winners, and at least one winner of American Idol. And all of them said after their big victory, "I'm going to Disney World." It was a brilliant little campaign because it brings up a big question. What do you do after you have won a huge victory? And a la Disney, I would like to retroactively ask the question on this Easter day of Jesus. Jesus, you have just won the ultimate victory, conquered the grave, defeated death, overcome sin, and saved the world. What are you going to do now? If I were Jesus, I could come up with some ideas of what I would do next. Maybe the first thing I'd do, go see old Caiaphas, the high priest. He was the one that delivered Jesus over to death under that bogus trial. He tore his robes because he accused Jesus of blasphemy. If I think I was Jesus, I'd just go over there and make an unannounced appearance to Caiaphas, the high priest. Just get right in his face and say, "Hey, high priest, here I am. You want to tear your robes again?" Or maybe just slip over to one of the people that had been there at that trial, because the text said that some of them struck Jesus, slapped him, and mocked him, and said, "You're the Messiah, prophesy to us, tell us, who was it that hit you?" I think if I was Jesus, I'd have just shown up for one of them, gotten back in their face, just one time, Jesus, just get in their face and just say, "I want to now answer your question. You were one of the ones that slapped me. I dare you to slap this resurrected face." or maybe, maybe go to Pilate, the Roman governor. He was the one that at first said that he wanted to wash his hands of the matter, but he went on to deliver Jesus to his death. He ignored his wife, who sent him a secret message that said, I had a dream about this man, don't have anything to do with this righteous man. But Pilate was swayed by the crowd, and they said, give us Barabbas, and the custom of letting one criminal go, and he let go this heinous criminal Barabbas, and instead he delivered Jesus into their hands to be crucified. I think if I was Jesus, I might have just had to sneak over to the Roman palace and just get in front of Pilate and just say, Governor, you really should have listened to your wife. Here I am. Or maybe get all the disciples and just go and stand on the steps, those giant steps of the temple, where there was so much activity and people passing by, and just have Jesus, I can just see it, and the band of all the disciples, and just stand up there until a huge crowd assembled. Put your arms around each other like that and just stand there until there's a big crowd, and then just start singing, we are the champions, we are the champions of the world. Or maybe go to Rome and visit the emperor and say, who's the real king now? Or at least write your memoirs and get a big advance and take a scroll tour across the world telling your story. These are some of the things you might think. Jesus, you've just saved the world and defeated death. What are you going to do now? And Jesus said, I'm going to go hang out with my old buddies in Galilee. It's not an impressive place. Nobody goes to Galilee to celebrate. But it was very clear it's what Jesus wanted to do. Because after the Last Supper, he told them, you think you're going to be faithful to me, but you're not. You're going to scatter and abandon me when I need you the most. But here's what I want you to remember. After I rise, go meet me in Galilee. We're going to go back to our old fishing spot. We're going to go back to our old hangout. I'll look forward to seeing you in Galilee. Why? That's what I want to think with you about this Easter. Why was it so important to Jesus to meet them in Galilee? And maybe, as you tune your heart to the Holy Spirit, you might hear in a unique way the invitation to you as well, that Jesus might be saying to us all, meet me in Galilee. Why? Well, I think the first and simplest explanation that I would assume is that it was home. When Dorothy clicked those heels of those red slippers, ruby red slippers together and said, there's no place like home, there's no place like home, there's no place like home, she was speaking a real truth, wasn't she? There's just no place quite like home. We love home. We long for home. Galilee wasn't impressive, but it was home. It was there in the rural hillsides and valleys and fields of Galilee, along the big lake known as the Sea of Galilee, or the Tiberias Sea, or Gennesaret, all those names referring to this beautiful rural area, just with simple farmers and merchants and fishermen. And that's where Jesus grew up, in a little town called Nazareth, a little podunk town. Think of Mayberry minus Barney Fife. And that's where Jesus grew up. And that's where Jesus called the first disciples. He called Simon and Andrew from their nets at the Sea of Galilee, and John and James, the sons of Zebedee, and said, follow me. And so it was that he got his first disciples. And these 12 men, he spent time with them there. His first miracle was at a little town called Cana of Galilee. Such an insignificant town, scholars have difficulty even locating it historically. But that's where he had his first public miracle. At a wedding feast there, he turned water into wine. In Capernaum, Much happened there on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's the place where at one time these friends lowered down their friend on a pallet down through the roof because he was paralyzed, and just to get him in front of Jesus, and Jesus had compassion on him and forgave his sins and healed him. And people began to realize how powerful this teacher was. This is the place where he taught the masses and said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is where he fed 5,000. This is where he delivered the oppressed and comforted the afflicted, and just spent time with these disciples. They were like any friends. They had their places that they hung out. They had their families. They were Galileans. It was rural. They would have had an accent. And that's probably part of the reason that they recognized Peter after the crucifixion, they said, you sound like a Galilean. It was just rural countryside, and it was home. There's no place like home. And when you have something wonderful happen, don't you want to share it with those at home first? The ones that are closest to you, that's where you want to celebrate the most. So I know that people think that just because my Tar Heels lost out too early in the NCAA tournament, that I grew silent about basketball. And they think I'm a poor sport, but I just want you to know, no. I continue to follow basketball all throughout, women's basketball, of course. The women's basketball is very fun to watch, and you heard me talk often. My son is a graduate from Baylor. I'm a big Baylor fan, and so, of course, the Baylor women won the national championship. So just want to be on the record that I did win a national championship after all. Anyway, they had their Final Four in Tampa, Florida, and I'm sure that those women, they celebrated on the court, they celebrated in the locker room, but I also look online and still read the Waco Tribune and saw that when the women returned to Waco, they had a parade for them in downtown. It was down by the Brazos River and those downtown streets of Waco that I know very well, and well-wishers and fans were all there celebrating with them. Because it's one thing to celebrate when you've had a big win and you're in some faraway place. It's another thing to celebrate when you come home and they have a parade. I don't know they had a parade for Jesus and the disciples, but I'm just saying that you want to have a connection with those that you love. When Tiger Woods won the Masters last weekend in a historic sports moment, one of the great comebacks of all time in sports, this man who'd had 4 back surgeries that nobody thought would ever play again, much less win again, much less win at the highest level. Well, when he won, there were tens of thousands of fans gathered around the 18th green at Augusta National Golf Club chanting, "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." But what Tiger did was he ran off the green because he wanted to find his little boy and his little girl and celebrate with them. It's not that the other tens of thousands don't mean anything. It's just that Tiger said later, the thing I wanted most was to go find my kids, because the last time he won a major championship, this little boy wasn't even born, and his daughter, I think, would have barely born, would even not remember it. You just want to celebrate with those that you love. And I know that's the way I feel, that if something good happens with me, I want to find my wife. I want to find my kids. You want to find your best friends. There's something about celebrating at home. But maybe the greatest image of celebrating at a homecoming is really when you've been at war and you have battled together and you've been in some faraway place, and then you want to just come home with the people that you won the battle for and those that you've won it with. And so probably the most iconic celebration I can think of a homecoming is our soldiers coming back from World War II in New York City in a massive parade, and people celebrating, confetti flying, and welcoming home those who had gone to war. And Jesus had gone to war. And these disciples were caught up in the spiritual warfare and fell prey to the wiles of the enemy, and they felt defeated, but Jesus was victorious. And though it was only in an invisible realm, Jesus did go and make a spectacle, the scripture says, in the heavenlies of all the demonic principalities, because he had conquered. And what Jesus wanted to do, he wanted to reunite with his good friends back home to celebrate there in that place. And that makes sense to me. Meet me in Galilee. But it's not just going home. It's not just that you celebrate in your home place with your family and your friends. That's important. There's something deeper that's happening. When they went back to Galilee, they went back as a people who were changed. They went back as a people who now had witnessed the power of God and knew that Jesus was alive. And so they'd followed Jesus. They had hoped he was the Messiah. They'd said they believed he was the Messiah. And some of them even swore that they would never betray him. And yet people like Peter, he did deny him 3 times, which just showed us that as much as they thought they really believed Jesus, that until the Lord was raised from the dead, they didn't really know down deep in their hearts that he was really the Lord. So I think Jesus wanted to take them back to Galilee so that they could experience home, their usual places and the familiar faces, and experience it all with an entirely new perspective. Now they know that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is giving them a gift, the resurrected Christ back in Galilee to the same old places. Somebody once asked me, would you ever want to go back to adolescence again? They said, would you ever want to go back and be a middle schooler again? And most people will go, no. Well, but I would say yes, under one condition. I'll go back and be a middle schooler again, but I get to know in middle school what I now know. Because if I knew then what I now know, I would have felt very differently every day during middle school. So when I was in 7th grade and I was in an election to see if I would or a new kid in school would be elected the 7th grade student representative on the student cabinet at Mendenhall School, when they announced over the speaker in homeroom after everybody had voted all over that the other kid had won, I now know that not being the 7th grade student representative didn't matter at all. It's not something that shows up on your resume, and it's not something that I'd even given any thought to in many, many years until some reason it came to mind with this sermon illustration. And I would be so much happier if I had been sitting there in my homeroom listening to it, if I then knew what I now know, and that is it didn't matter at all, but instead I quietly crumbled there in my little 7th grade seat and homeroom. Now, I'd go back and do middle school again if I could have known then what I now know. So then when it came time for the 8th grade dance, and I didn't have a date, and all the cool kids were going to the dance, and I didn't really want to go to the dance, but I felt like I just had to go to the dance, so I finally went up into my mother's room, which was one of the only 2 places we had a telephone in the house, and the only place you could close the door and have any privacy, and went up there and nervously dialed the number of this girl, who I don't even know if she really wanted to go either, but she did say yes, and we went to the dance. I guess we had a reasonable, good enough time, but if I were to go back, and I would know that actually in my senior year of college, God was going to bring to me the woman that he had picked out for my life partnership to walk down the same path of life. And then all these years later, 33, nearly 34 years of marriage, and I have these 2 kids and a wonderful daughter-in-law, and who cares if I went to an 8th grade dance or not, but it seemed like the world to me at the time. What I'm saying is that if you could go back home, Galilee, but you could do so with an entirely new perspective, wouldn't it change everything? And Jesus is meeting the disciples back in their old fishing spots. It's interesting because we don't really know that much about all the activities they celebrated together in Galilee, but we know about one event in great detail. We learn about it in John chapter 21. They've met in Galilee, and John 21 verse 1, after this Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, that's at Galilee, and revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to him, I'm going fishing. Let me just pause there and say, see, that's what I'm talking about. After all of this emotional upheaval and all of the longing and the angst and the betrayal and the failure and the sin and the hope and the longing and the elation that Jesus is alive and the tomb is empty and they're back in Galilee and they're waiting to meet Jesus, and Simon just says, I'm just going to do something I know I'm comfortable with. I'm going fishing. It's what he does. And they said, we're going to go with you. And they went out and got in the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples didn't know it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? And they answered him, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. So they cast it. And then they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's what John called himself, therefore said to Peter, it's the Lord. And Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord. He put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat and dragged the net full of fish, and they went on up the shore, and they had breakfast with some fish with Jesus. And what's so interesting about this story is that this almost exact same story occurs is the very moment in which Jesus called these people into discipleship. It's really interesting because in Luke chapter 5, just listen to this similarity. Luke 5 verse 1, on one occasion while the crowd was pressing in to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them, and they were washing their nets. And getting one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out in the deep and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we toiled all night, same story, toiled all night and caught nothing. But at your word, I'll let down the nets. And when they'd done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking, and they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And when Peter saw all of this, he fell at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord. And Jesus had to tell him, do not be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching men. It really is a story, as John Eldridge has pointed out, that marks the playfulness of Jesus. He did this on purpose. He said, I want to meet you back in Galilee, and I think he already knew they're going to go fishing, and I'm going to do the same thing I did 3 years ago when I called them as disciples, and I'm going to tell them to put the nets down on the other side, and they're going to have so many fish, and it's going to be a very different reaction this time. And so with a wink and with a kind of casual, the resurrected Jesus standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, just kind of standing there with his hands in his pockets and just kind of, hey guys, y'all catching anything today? And first they don't even know who he is. They say, no, we've been fishing all night. And he said, well, I'll try the other side of the boat. They put it down there. And all of a sudden, the memory from 3 years earlier all comes rushing back, because this is the way they were called to the ministry in the first place. And in the first instance, Peter had said, woe is me. Depart from me, because I'm a sinful man. But this time, as soon as he realized it was Jesus, he just threw on his cloak, jumped in, and just started swimming for joy to get on the beach and be with Jesus, because it's the same place and the same event, but they see it entirely differently. When you have seen the risen Jesus, everything looks different to you. All of your interactions are different. They went back home, but Thomas Wolfe was right. You can't go home again. people change. You change. What Jesus wanted to do was take them home as a new people. It's a tension we live in as Christians. If you were today to meet Jesus for the first time, which I pray if you haven't, that this will be the day you meet him. But if you meet Jesus today, if in faith you say yes to his saving grace, if you open up your heart and God enables you to see Jesus, and you say yes to him, you will look the same when you leave. And you have the same clothes on and same appearance. And other people might look at you and go, nothing's changed. But you would know everything has changed. C.S. Lewis captured this tension in his famous Chronicles of Narnia, in which he describes these 4 children that happen through a wardrobe at a professor's house where they're staying during wartime outside of London. They stumble into a magical world called Narnia, where they find that there they are kings and queens. And they do warfare with the White Witch, and they rule and befriend talking beavers and other creatures, and they reign as they relate to this majestic lion named Aslan, who clearly is a symbol of Christ, and they are a picture of the children of God. But what's so interesting is at the end of their first adventure, they come back into that wardrobe, and in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, we read, before they'd gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches but through coats, and the next moment they all came tumbling out of the wardrobe door into an empty room, and they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. And this professor that they were staying with was a remarkable man. And he didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believed the whole story. And then he said, what's that? Yes, of course. You'll get back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. There's the tension. They're actually kings and queens, but once they came back to that wardrobe and they were just in England again, normal people saw them as just ordinary kids, but they were extraordinary. When Jesus met the disciples in Galilee, the disciples might have looked the same, but nothing looked the same to the disciples because they had become kings and queens. They had become co-heirs with Christ, and they knew it. Everything had changed. It's all to say, Jesus, I think, wanted to go back to Galilee, not just because it's home, and there's something wonderful about the familiar and something special about celebrating with your own family and those you love and know best. But it is to say that if you were to accept Christ today, and I were to come to you and say, you have just been born anew and given eternal life. It's the greatest victory imaginable, what Jesus has done for you, and now it's become alive to you. What are you going to do now? And you might think that when something like that happens in your life, that God would start calling you to go to some exotic place and go to some faraway world. And sometimes he does make a missionary call like that. But most of the time, what I'm saying is that he would say, no, here's the best thing in the world. Go right back to your Galilee. If you came and listened and heard this message and nobody else in your family did, and something inside of you was warmed, and maybe you had been a Christian for years but had lost the fire within you, and something awakened within you this very day, God would say, here's what I think would be best. I'll meet with you right back in your own home. I'll see you next week in the office. There's something beautiful about the wisdom of Jesus saying, I'll meet you in Galilee, because this is how we're going to change the world. We're going to go back into our ordinary places with an extraordinary new perspective, knowing that Jesus is alive. Wow. Jesus, you've conquered sin and death. You've saved the world. And you are proven to be the King of Kings. Where are you going next? Just going to Galilee. And maybe what he's saying to you on this Easter day is the same. How about meeting me in Galilee, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary? And that's the gospel.